We respectfully acknowledge the University of Arizona is on the land and territories of indigenous peoples. Today, Arizona is home to 22 federally recognized tribes, with Tucson being home to the O'odham and Yaqui. Committed to diversity and inclusion, the university strives to build sustainable relationships with sovereign Native nations and indigenous communities through education offerings, partnerships, and community service.
Welcome to this episode of the PA Path Podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Lohenry, and we are glad you can join us as we seek to better understand the PA profession.
That right now we live in very exciting times, and we have the opportunity to expand the scope of practice of a lot of medical professionals. For example, Corona is a catalyst for that, because we realize there's a necessity for more hands and brains in healthcare.
Well, hello, and thank you again for joining us today. Today, we're going to explore the PA profession in Germany. We are delighted to have our honored guest, Dr. Marcus Hoffman, join us. Dr. Hoffman played a major role in the establishment of the Further Education Decree, Physician Assistant, of the state of Baden-Württemberg, Germany, which grants an academic degree to successful graduates of this program and entitles them to use the additional professional designation, State-Approved Physician Assistant. He was also a key member of the Joint Working Group Academic Healthcare Professions of the German Medical Association and the National Association of Statutory Health Insurance Physicians, which developed the concept paper Physician Assistant, a new profession in the German healthcare system. As always, you can learn more about our guest at our website, papathpodcast.com. We hope you enjoy this episode.
Hello.
Guten Abend.
Guten Abend. Guten Morgen.
How are you, Marcus?
Good. I'm good.
Well, Marcus, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today. We're just so excited to learn about the model of this profession in Germany. You know, you and I go back quite a few years when you first visited USC, and it's really great to have you on the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Let's start with learning about your path, because you're a family physician, as I recall. So you have a unique experience that exposed you to the PA profession, and ultimately you became one of the international leaders of the profession. So why don't you tell us about your particular path to getting involved with PAs?
Yeah, it's quite interesting, because when I went to medical school during that whole time, I never came in touch with physician assistants or for example, other healthcare professionals like nurse practitioners, because at that time we did not have any of them in Germany. But that doesn't mean we never had any in Europe, or maybe a different name. Maybe for some of you, the name Feldchair sounds familiar. So we've always had the concept of non-physician professionals being part of the medical team, one or the other. Civilian and military over the course of centuries. So, for example, the before mentioned Feldchair was part of several armies during the 30-year war in Germany, which took place in the 17th century. So I came in touch with the name physician assistant, which is very difficult to pronounce for Germans, by the way. But I give you the German equivalent, or the German translation, which is probably difficult for you to pronounce. It's called Arztassistent, meaning Arzt is the German word for doctor or physician, and assistant is like assistant.
Sure.
I do not think this translation is appropriate to what the scope of practice, as far as the scope of practice is regarded, but that's the official German translation we have so far. Obviously, it's also an ongoing discussion worldwide about how to describe this profession and the scope of practice that entails with the correct name. So physician assistant is. I studied medicine in Germany. You start studying medicine out of high school. It takes 6 years to complete your studies. And then I was one of the few people who were still drafted into the military service. And I was fortunate enough to be sent abroad That's what they told me. You are going to be sent abroad. And at that time, it was exciting because at that time, the German military did not really have engagement abroad. So I was excited to go abroad, and abroad meant you are going to Belgium, which is a small country in Europe. and
not quite what you were imagining, I guess.
Yeah. And so it's obviously the seat of the European Parliament, and also the seat of NATO. And also the military NATO headquarters, they are called SHAPE, Supreme Headquarters Allied Forces Europe, is located in Belgium. And that's where they sent me. And this community is very interesting. And there's at that time, there were about 10,000 people living there, families, people from more than 30 nations, NATO and affiliated nations, also representatives from Warsaw Pact at that time. Very, very interesting. And most interesting for me, and that closes the circle to your question, I was able to work with physician assistants there because there is a hospital which has an American medical director. And under the roof of that hospital, all other nations have their small clinics. So I worked in the German clinic. My neighbor across the hallway was an Italian family physician. Next door was a French physician. We had meetings in the mornings. Initially, I spoke a little bit of English, of course, high school English, but the abbreviations in medical English, they were a real challenge to me. Sure. And also how to learn how do we work in a team, we as Germans, how do other nations work in a team? And that really shaped my idea of medicine because it was completely new to me. And also the deputy commander of this hospital was a male nurse, an officer. Mm-hmm. And for me, naive, not used to that, it was amazing for me to see that you could have a career as a non-physician in the military, as an officer, high-ranking officer. I think it was a lieutenant colonel, and to be deputy commander of such an installation. It was an eye-opener. Sure. A very positive experience for me, and that's how I first worked with PAs. After that, after my time as a draftee in the German army, I went on to my residency. I spent some time working as a research assistant in public health, and I never forgot. But I was absorbed in the German medical system after that for a while actually. And the next time I came in touch with the name physician assistant was when I was working at Heidelberg Medical University. And there was an initiative from the state of Baden-Württemberg, which is in the southwest of Germany, a very innovative state, home to Porsche, Mercedes-Benz, and so on. So very technology-driven. And of course, home to several very reputable medical schools. There was a minister of education and of science who was trained at Berkeley, among other places. And he was familiar with non-physician professions during his time there. And he wanted to establish the PA profession because he foresaw the shortage of medical workforce. And he wanted to build a perspective for healthcare professions besides the traditional. So they came up with this plan, and they were looking for somebody who could who knew how to pronounce the word physician assistant. So number one,
that's the step one. You have to be able to pronounce
step one. There was the door opener, and then they were really surprised to hear that I worked with PAs, and I was quite familiar with the concept. What I didn't mention earlier was that I also spent some time as a volunteer during a deployment in Afghanistan. So this is where I really learned to rely on PAs as valuable parts of the medical team. Mm-hmm. That's when you really know what people are able to do. And it really, opened my heart again the second time after my first time as a draftee in more or less peaceful setting at NATO headquarters,
Sure.
it really opened my heart to the profession. And, when this opportunity arose, I took it by the horns. I grasped it, the opportunity. And so I started with a lot of enthusiasm, establishing this profession with 11 students. I always say I started with a soccer team. Because that's the number of players in a soccer team, And even though I'm not so familiar with this game, which is interesting for a German, I guess, but it's a nice metaphor.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, even more so because I'm so proud of the fact that we started with the number 11 in 2010. And usually in Germany, we enroll the new students in any kind of study course on the 1st of October. That's when our winter semester starts,
Okay.
And so for the first time since we enrolled those first 11 students in last October, the number exceeded 1,000 enrollees. And this, of course, is not at the program I have established or in 2010, but it's in a total of more than 25 programs all over Germany now. So 100-fold expansion or multiplication in 10 years. I'm so proud of it.
You should be.
Yeah, I'm so happy to see this profession thrive.
So you started with this concept of first I have to be able to pronounce this title, and then I'm going to start a pilot of 11 students. What were some of the early challenges as you tried to introduce this to your physician colleagues and the Minister of Health and others in Germany?
Right. So we had the backing from the Ministry of Science initially. And then there was a change in parties, in policies, and then it was not on the priority list anymore to establish the PA profession. There were other priorities, and I must say, from my very good experiences internationally with the PA profession, on a practical level, on an educational level, on a level of interacting, relying on PAs. I was struck. I was almost shocked by the fact that not everybody wanted PAs desperately.
Sure.
To phrase it carefully. So there was initially a lot of opposition from the medical association, from the German Medical Association. There was a lot of opposition from other healthcare professional associations, but I now see that it's understandable. There's something new. There's a new concept. There's an unknown factor, and that's how they looked at the at this new profession, unpronounceable profession. And so I engaged in a lot of discussions with the German Medical Association, with funding authorities. That's always important because the question was and is still in some areas, how do we finance this new profession? I engaged with a lot of discussions with other healthcare professionals and their professional associations, and it became a constructive discussion. So we had initial funding from the ministry to establish this program, but we also had to evaluate the whereabouts of our graduates and whether they find an appropriate position as physician assistant in a healthcare setting or not, and how they are perceived by other healthcare professions, also by patients, and how do they feel in their new profession. So what we did is we did this mandatory study of the first two graduation classes, and it was a huge success. And that was the first breakthrough for this profession. But as you can imagine, so this was in 2015. So it took 5 years
Of course.
For the first 2 classes to graduate, because our program in Germany, our PA programs are bachelor's programs of 6 semesters. So 3 years of training, and then 2 classes, and then we ask the graduates, and we ask their environment, and there was a big breakthrough, and so that meant the government funding for those classes would be continued. There was a big boost for the profession. So in Germany, you have to know we have basically 2 parts of our healthcare system. They're a bit separated. So we have hospitals where people are treated as inpatients, and these are financed from a different pot, than the ambulatory care with private practices and so on. It's 2 different sources of funding for those 2, and it is was easier to implement the PA profession in the hospital setting, also because there was a bigger demand and a better understanding, I must say, especially in certain specialties. For example, trauma surgery, very pragmatic. And a lot of trauma surgeons and German trauma surgeons have either spent time in the United States or other countries where PAs are definitely part of the team, or in some cases, for example, in cardiac surgery, we have American trained physicians that work in Germany and that help establishing the profession because they know how valuable PAs are as part of the team. So most of our graduates ended up working in a clinical setting in hospital care for inpatients.
That's really smart. So essentially by getting them placed with folks that had experience with PAs in the United States, you were able to kind of get to a tipping point of acceptance in the culture of medicine there.
Yes. What you need is, like with any new idea, you need proponents. We had a few and we built on them. We had a few doctors who knew PAs and were all convinced that they are true gain for the team and a valuable profession for Germany. And also we had economists that said and statisticians who said, we cannot train as many physicians as we need in the future in Germany. So I guess it's a similar setting and a similar outlook in many of the Western countries. Mm-hmm. The second, setting that we are focusing on now are rural areas. I guess this is where the US PA profession started out from. A shortage of primary health providers in rural areas. Germany is not as big, but we also have rural areas where there is or will be a drastic shortage of family physicians. And so slowly there's an understanding that PAs might fill the gap. While I don't really like that phrase, but you know what I'm referring to. And also we have migration from the rural areas, also of young people, of professionals into the city areas. But even there, in bigger cities, there are, let's say, medical deserts, places where there's no family physician readily available. So we are working on concepts how to implement PAs and maybe also other new healthcare professions into those practices or into that population-based healthcare setting.
So Marcus, you were describing that you're now at about 25 programs in Germany.
Yeah.
At what point in the evolution of the profession in Germany did you go from the one program to whatever the number was next, and then to 25? How did that all roll out?
Yeah, it was initially we were quite alone. And then the first 2, 3, 4 years, there were 1 or 2 more programs popping up. And like I said, I guess a motivation also for other universities or institutions of higher education to also start a PA program was the evaluation that I referred to before, the very positive outlook of everybody involved with PAs. We published that and it was very well received. in the German public. So there was one breakthrough. That's when it started to the number of programs all over Germany started to rise. And another breakthrough was a regulation and a recommendation that was published by the German Medical Association and by the, let's say, financing bodies. I'm making this up, this translation, because some of the German terms and institutions are not that easily to pronounce or to translate.
Sure.
Anyway, so the breakthrough really came with the publication of evaluation results and the publication of a framework for the physician assistant profession by the German Medical Association. And
that makes a lot of sense, right? You finally have data, you have regulation, you have an endorsement, and you have the funders that are willing to fund an expansion of this.
Exactly. So we worked on all those fronts, but it took 5-6 years until it really kicked in. And I'm not a very patient person, but I learned patience through this through this process. And I looking back at the history of PAs in the United States and the evolution, and you and I discussed this many times, and I've read about the history of PAs in the United States. So we are on a fast track because we have a blueprint.
Sure.
So, for example, we are, like I mentioned before, we're still graduating our PAs on a bachelor's level. So that's okay for now, but there will be master's programs like in the United States. But I guess 20 years ago, most PA programs in the United States were also bachelor's programs. So maybe we are at that point at the moment. But, and we can talk about it, the scope of practice of PAs in Germany, although the concept is the same. As part of the team of the physicians team, the scope of practice is not where I want it to be yet.
Sure. Yeah, it takes time. I agree. And just to do a comparison, the U.S. medical school path is slightly different than the German medical school path. You described, you go right down that path, right in from high school into college. It's 6 years. And then I presume if you choose to do a residency, you can do that. I believe in the UK that results in a master's degree initially. Is that the same in Germany?
Not for physicians. We still have this old fashioned track. We have that for other professions too, but most study programs, most academic programs have been switched to bachelor's and or consecutive master's programs for most professions. For the medical profession, we still have the so-called Staatsexamen, the public exam, government exam.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about your program that you started and maybe the evolution of the curriculum in Germany. How did you first develop that program? What is the typical? You said 3 years was the time frame, but how much didactic? What are the things you're teaching in the blueprint? Where do you do your rotations? What does that look like for a typical applicant as they're exploring your program?
Yes. So in Germany, every university or every institution of higher learning has freedom. There's a freedom of teaching, and since there is no government mandated curriculum, we were able to start with a blueprint taken from the US model. So I did not create all of the first of the initial PA program. There were people in the background that had done a lot of preparation work, and they had taken the blueprint from the US PA programs. Mm-hmm. But one of the biggest difference is the following. So our program, a 3-year program, was structured as follows. So our students went for lectures, classroom training. They had their classroom training for 3 months. Then they went on clinical rotation for another 3 months. So one semester of 6 months consists of 3 months classroom training and then practical applications. So, and we do this, or we did this 6 times, 6 semesters. And then they graduate and then they write a bachelor's thesis and so on. And at the end, of course, we also had a practical exam that we did together with some of the most reputable university hospitals in a patient-centered setting.
Sure.
But this is not mandatory. And then after we had started with the program, and I mentioned some more programs came to existence, and they were slightly different. For example, they had different standards for enrollment. They had different rotation schematics. But basically, it's the same as in the United States. You study initially basic sciences, and then more and more you gain an understanding of the clinical setting. You get more and more engaged with patients during your clinical rotations, and so on. And we also had, from the beginning, some electives that you could choose from. For example, if you're very interested in trauma surgery and orthopedics, you could take some extra classes, electives in that, or in other fields. And there was also to train people according to demand, because we had, of course, done some market research, and we were looking at where is the demand. And of course, the trauma surgeons, there was a high demand, pragmatic profession, and others too. And so we offered this as elective. So the challenge was initially, one of the challenges, obviously there were many challenges, but the next challenge was, so when there were more programs starting in Germany, they were different, obviously, from ours, which is not bad, which might be a good thing. And the idea was the same. But in order to establish a profession, a solid profession, you have to stand together, and you have to have at least a basic framework, a mandatory framework, which was not easy to do because there was no legal framework. So what we had to do was we had to find a place where we could discuss this, and we had to find an authority that could at least give us, guidance on this, or an authority that everybody respected outside of politics. And that was the German Medical Association and the funding authorities. And so we came together as representatives from several universities, and we compared our curricula. And obviously, everyone was convinced theirs was the best, maybe, or not. So we had this typical discussion. But after the very short time of 2 years, I'm joking, because to me, there was an eternity.
Well, we've been working at it for 50 years, so you're doing okay.
Yeah. So we reached an agreement. And so we have some core subjects that every program should have, and these are the recommendations that were published by the German Medical Association. And after that, every new program took these recommendations and the curriculum and built on that. So there was goal achieved on that part. There are differences still in clinical rotation. There are differences in emphasis, for example, more on family care or more on this or that. In some of the programs, I think very similar to the programs in the United States, but we have a standard, a set standard. I guess we'll be able to work on this standard, and I'm looking forward to doing that, because I mentioned the scope of practice of PAs in Germany, and that is not enough for me yet.
Yeah. So when you think about the ideal scope of practice, are you falling closer to what you experienced in Afghanistan with the military PAs?
Yeah, I mean, that would be optimal. Obviously, you cannot transfer military standards to a civilian setting all the time or equally. But so let me talk about the scope of practice in Germany. So for PAs in Germany are part of the medical team, and they work responsibly, but under the doctor's authorization, the physician's authorization. So we also call it delegation. Mm-hmm. So tasks are delegated to PAs. And this can be done on a one-on-one basis, but it can also be done after the physician, and that's a legal requirement for any kind of delegation of tasks to non-physicians. if the physician knows the person and they know they can perform, and that's true for all other professions also in the medical field, then they can perform their tasks by themselves. It sounds very complicated, but that's the framework we have right now.
Sure.
Physician assistants in Germany cannot prescribe, which is difficult sometimes, and maybe there will be new laws enabling this, but right now only physicians can prescribe medication in Germany. There are some model programs, some evaluation going on for non-physicians to prescribe medication, and I hope that will foster and expand the scope of practice for PAs as well. We will see.
And I presume you have pharmacology and pharmacotherapeutics in your curriculum.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
They're trained on the drugs. They're just not able to prescribe.
Exactly. And another anecdote of one of the many discussions I've had with healthcare professionals, and this one with pharmacists. And because I've had pharmacists, very reputable pharmacists, teaching at my program, and they said, okay, we teach him all we know. And I discussed with him. I said, hey, what do you think about PAs prescribing, and not just the physician colleagues that prescribe and you fill the prescription? And the pharmacists were a bit reluctant. And I said, hey, we know more about pharmaceuticals than sometimes also physician colleagues. And I would agree, no physician knows everything. Nobody knows everything in every field. And so why should we not get prescription rights first? That was their question, because in Germany, they also don't have prescription rights. It's just an anecdote. But that is something and this is very, very current development, COVID. So maybe that we're trying to vaccinate a lot more people until the end of the year. That's what our new government proposed and wants to do. And so they are discussing about pharmacists vaccinating. I know in the United States it's normal and standard procedure, but in Germany it's not. So maybe this discussion of task sharing forced by this unfortunate pandemic can help open the mind of people.
Yeah. When I first graduated from PA school in the United States, I practiced in the state of Illinois, and we were not allowed to prescribe in Illinois initially. And what was intriguing for me was that, we took the same pharmacology course as the DO students at the university I attended, from the exact same professors, and had the same tests and the same number of hours of pharmacology and pharmacotherapeutics. There were definitely differences in our total training around clinical hours and other things, but ultimately we were able to get that law changed about 2 years after I started practicing. But those first 2 years were tough. It made it very difficult on the patients and the team as well. But the patients, it makes it confusing. It lacks validity to the profession's intellect when they're not allowed to do that, to try to provide a smoother transition for the patient to get in and out of the practice. So I do hope that they come around soon for you.
Yes, and reality looks differently. When I was in residency and I had my first emergency on intensive care, elderly gentleman with a myocardial infarction, I relied on the staff, the non-physician staff on intensive care, to explain to me what the schematics were. I had to bear the responsibility, yes, but they had the experience. So, but I like to say in Germany, you need a driver's license for everything.
That's great.
Even for fishing, even for other things, and of course for serious tasks like prescribing. So if you're a physician, for example, I like to give that example. I have the license to do a transplant, but I would never do it. There are other people who are a lot more qualified. than me to do it. And so we have to rethink this concept that if you have this or that driver's license, in other words, your medical degree or your physician's license, that you're able to perform everything that can be done in medicine. Maybe there are other professions that are better suited to do that. But
well, and that's the classic argument for scope of practice, right? Scope of practice gives you the range to do the things that you have the experience to do, and it allows you the portability to take that with you into your next role. So in the PA world, if I've done dermatology for 10 years and then I go work in primary care, the fact that I in some states, I'm not allowed to practice the skills that I have been doing under the leadership of a dermatologist for 10 years, it's really just hurting the patients. It's hurting the health system.
I agree. I fully agree. And like in the United States, we also have a federal structure of our country. We have a federal system, and every state in Germany, we have 16 states, has their own requirements. They're very similar for the established medical professions, but they can make their own rules. And the first rules for PAs were done based on our curriculum, but they were basically an addition to nursing law. They were not a PA law in my state, but it was a beginning, So we have to go state by state to expand that. And I must say, and this is really a matter that counts a lot for me. It comes from my heart that right now we live in very exciting times, and we have the opportunity to expand the scope of practice of a lot of medical professionals. For example, Corona is a catalyst for that, because we realize there's a necessity for more hands and brains in healthcare, and so we do it, and we can tear down those barriers between professions and in our minds especially. We've discussed it. Why not? If you've worked for 10 years in dermatology, you probably know more about dermatology than I do, most likely 100%, because I never worked in dermatology. So that should be a certain standard that we have to look at, the time of training as well, but of course also qualification. So another aspect is that our new government in Germany, we just established a new government in Germany. They have in their contract, it's a coalition of 3 parties, and they made a contract and they outlined, different kinds of policies and ideas for the new government for the next 4 years. And for medical professions, they want to open up the scope of practice and also discuss or establish prescription rights, not for physician assistants explicitly, because it's still a small group in Germany, but for other professions and for direct access, for example, to other professions like physiotherapists, because right now in Germany it's still very complicated. If you need a referral to a physiotherapist, for example, because you broke your ankle and you need rehab, then you have to go to your family physician first, or to your orthopedic first, and he or she writes a prescription. And now there's discussion about direct access. Why not? Physiotherapists are very well trained.
It just clogs up access to the primary care providers who need to see people with real illness.
Exactly.
Yeah. We're in our remaining time. I'd love to ask you two more questions. First, I'm just so honored to interview the father of the profession for Germany. This is really cool. You must be very proud. When you look ahead, maybe 10 years from now, what do you envision that the best case scenario will be for your profession in that country?
Yes. First of all, thank you for giving me the honor to, call me the father of the profession. Of course, there was a team effort. And without many people who dared to do something new, we wouldn't be where we are now. But thank you. So in 10 years, I would like to be where the United States are at with the PA profession, meaning an expansion of programs, meaning it's the number 1 profession according to the ranking for years in a row. But I also envision other professions with more scope of practice developing, because they all will help tackle the challenges we're all facing. But especially for the PA profession, my hero and my blueprint is the United States, definitely. Master's programs as standards for PAs, prescription rights, etc., and a standard for Germany, for all federal states of Germany.
Fantastic. And the last question I wanted to ask you is, I know that you have, because of your role in Germany, you have taken on a leadership role in Europe as well. So could you briefly talk a little bit about where things are going in Europe as a whole for the profession?
Yes. There are several countries who champion the profession in Germany. I think the most advanced are the Netherlands within Europe. And I think their role is the most independent worldwide, actually, their PA role, which has been the source of many discussions as well, because PAs in the Netherlands can work independently from physicians. And it can be a good thing. It can be discussed, but the Netherlands are actually very far advanced when it comes to the PA profession. The other country who's really established the PA profession also in bylaws and laws is the United Kingdom, and then the Republic of Ireland, and also Germany. So my idea was, because initially we've had a group of people from the above mentioned or before mentioned countries, and we were discussing the profession. Also US PAs, they were helping to us to understand what does it mean, a PA profession? What does it mean to be a PA? What does a PA actually do in a setting, in a healthcare setting? So we've always had this discussion, this international discussion, because I think if we copy a name, we also have to copy or take a name and establish a profession. It has to have the same contents eventually, meaning same kind of education. I mean, every country has their own healthcare system, but at least similar. Sure. You know, like a physician is basically the same worldwide. A nurse is basically the same worldwide. So my goal from the beginning was that also the physician assistant standard is the same in Germany. That's why we had this working group with the German Medical Association, and we're working on federal laws regarding this. And also from the beginning, I tried to understand, so what's the scope of practice of PAs in the Netherlands? What's the prerequisite to be admitted to a PA school and so on? So in order to have a platform to discuss this and the pros and cons of every country's initiative, we established the EuroPAC, which is the European PA collaboration.
Nice.
It's spelled with a PA-C, like the certified PA. And one of the goals of this association is, of course, discussing, promoting the profession in Europe, but also with a big C, the certification is to find maybe a common European standard for a certification exam, like it is established in the United States. So we've had our first international meeting, and I think there was the first international PA meeting with that kind of attendance in Europe in 2019. It was a huge success. So we had representatives from AAPA, also from the American side, from ARC-PA, both presidents of those associations. We've had the leaders from all the countries, PA associations, and we've had very fruitful discussions in Berlin, and we initiated a discussion about a common certification exam. So then came COVID, then came Brexit.
Yeah.
Or Brexit first, then COVID, So at the moment, we are, I think, all those countries, most European countries, focused on the task at hand to
of course,
be able to find a way out of this pandemic. And but we're still talking. So we've had to skip the 2020 EuroPAC which was already planned for Berlin. And in 21, we only had a small event in Heidelberg. But I'm hopeful that we can revive this. And my goal is to have it in other countries too of Europe.
That's exciting.
Maybe in the Netherlands, they are much more organized. I must say, I think in the Netherlands they're already 10 years further than we are with the profession. But also, if you look at I'm sure you will talk to some of the leaders in the UK. They've also had tough times. Initially they had several programs, then they had to close down some, but eventually they found the allies in the English Medical Association, and now they're part of it. So I think the lesson learned is to talk within the profession, to discuss experiences, to learn from history, especially from the US history. That's what I like to look at, and to have a positive outlook. Because if you're convinced that the PA profession is something so positive, it will eventually be part of the medical system in any country.
Yeah, that same grit and determination we look for in our students is what we need to show as leaders as we build this up. Marcus, thank you so much. This is so interesting. I hope we can circle back in a year or two to kind of get an update on how things are going. But congrats on a great start. And we're very excited to watch you all grow there, and do really appreciate your time and insights.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to thank our guest, Dr. Marcus Hoffman, for sharing his perspectives about the PA profession in Germany. They have exciting things going on with the significant increase in PA programs, and we look forward to hearing more about our German colleagues in the future. Tune in next week as we speak to Mr. Quinten van den Drieschen from the Netherlands, who will share with us the origin of the PA profession in the Netherlands and where they stand today. They are one of the earliest adopters in Europe of our profession, and it'll be a very exciting informational conversation. Until next time, we wish you success with whatever path you are walking in life, and thank you for joining us. The purpose of this podcast is to provide news and information on the PA profession and is for informational purposes only. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the speakers and guests and do not necessarily reflect the official position or policy of the University of Arizona.